I was 16 when I first went winter camping with my Boy Scout troop. It was an experience I won't ever forget. We stayed in an old log cabin tucked deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines and dense thickets. The cold air bit at my skin as we set up camp, but the cabin was warm, and we had plenty of food and supplies. Still, there was something about being out there in the wilderness that made me uneasy. The thick layer of snow, the bare trees, and the isolation gave it all a quiet, eerie feeling. But for the most part, I was excited for the adventure, the break from the usual routine, and the chance to spend some time with my friends. The trip had been going fine up until that night. We had spent the day hiking, building shelters, and working on various skills, but the night was when things took a turn. A few of the older guys and I decided to sneak away from the cabin once the campfire had died down. We were looking for a place to smoke. It was no secret that we had a stash of pot and cigarettes hidden, and we were planning on finding a quiet spot in the woods to indulge. The air was freezing as we made our way through the trees, the snow crunching beneath our boots. We kept our voices low, not wanting to disturb the other scouts back at the cabin. After about a half-mile, we found a small clearing, sheltered by tall, thick trees. We set up in a circle, the dim light from my flashlight casting long, flickering shadows across the snow-covered ground. The wind howled through the trees, causing the branches to creak like old bones. There was a strange, unsettling quietness to it all, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I had a knot in my stomach as I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. It was probably nothing, I told myself, just nerves from being out in the dark woods. I passed the flashlight around, and we all settled in. One by one, we lit up, the pungent smell of marijuana mixing with the fresh, cold air. As we sat there, I felt it, a prickling sensation creeping up my spine. At first, it was subtle, just a faint feeling, but it quickly grew into something more. It was the distinct feeling of being watched. I shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the clearing. The trees stood tall, their dark branches swaying in the wind, but nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. I took another hit, trying to ignore the unease creeping up on me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It only intensified. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees, or maybe an animal moving in the distance. But when I turned my head and shone the flashlight in that direction, my blood ran cold. There, standing motionless against one of the trees, was a man. He was tall, with pale skin that seemed almost white in the light. His face was gaunt, and he had a long, white beard. His clothes were old, worn, and mismatched, but he didn't seem to be wearing anything that made sense for the conditions. It wasn't like he was dressed for the winter at all. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge the beam of light hitting him directly in the face. He just stood there, staring at us with an unnerving intensity. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, and they locked onto ours with a cold, dead stare. I froze. I wasn't sure what I was seeing. Was this some kind of joke? Maybe someone else from the camp was messing with us. But as I looked around, I saw the same shock on the faces of the other guys in the circle. Nobody was joking. My brother, who was one of the guys with me, was the first to break the silence. He whispered, barely audible, "Who the hell is that?" I didn't have an answer. My heart was pounding in my chest as I slowly shined the light at each of the other trees, scanning the surrounding area. But there was nothing, just the man standing there unmoving, watching us. He didn't seem to be holding a weapon, nor did he show any signs of aggression. But the sheer oddness of it all sent a wave of panic through me. "What do we do?" One of the other guys whispered, his voice shaky. I didn't know. None of us knew. We just stood there, staring at the man, unsure of what to do next. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get back to the safety of the cabin. but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. The longer I stared, the more I felt like I was sinking deeper into something I didn't understand. It was as if the whole world around us had gone quiet, except for the sound of my own breathing, ragged and shallow. After what felt like an eternity, the man didn't move. He just stood there, frozen in place. The only thing that kept me from bolting right then and there was the fact that he wasn't doing anything. He wasn't coming closer or making any moves toward us. It was as if he was simply observing us, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I quickly grabbed my brother's arm and whispered, "We need to go, now." Without waiting for a response, I stood up, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The others followed suit, getting to their feet and grabbing their gear. We didn't say a word as we turned and began walking back toward the cabin, our footsteps muffled by the snow. Every once in a while, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following us. But each time, there was nothing, just the darkness of the woods behind us. We didn't speak a word of it when we returned to the cabin. We acted like nothing had happened, like it was just some strange encounter in the woods. But I could see in my brother's eyes that he felt the same way I did, that something had been off about the whole thing. It wasn't until later, when we were alone, that we finally spoke about it. We still didn't know who the man was. There was no logical explanation for why he was out there in the woods, in the dead of winter, alone and just standing there. We didn't know if he had gotten lost, if he was a drifter, or if there was something more sinister about him. And we certainly didn't know why he had been staring at us with that eerie, dead-eyed gaze. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it sometimes. I wonder if he was just a confused old man who had wandered too far from civilization, or if he had some darker intentions. The more I think about it, the more I feel like we were lucky to get away without any trouble. Some part of me still wonders if we saw something we weren't meant to see. The thing that still bothers me the most, though, is how he just stood there. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't try to approach us. He just stood in the dark, staring at us, his eyes filled with something I can't quite place. It was as if he was waiting for something. Or maybe we were the ones he was waiting for. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, and I never will. The woods are a strange place, and sometimes the people or things you encounter out there are even stranger. Whether that man was just a lost wanderer or something else entirely, I don't know. But I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. And that night, everything about that encounter felt wrong. In the end, we were lucky. We got out of there without incident. But the memory of those cold, dead eyes staring at us from the shadows will stick with me for the rest of my life. I always preferred camping alone, the kind of trips where you can get away from the noise and distractions of the world, the kind of peace that only comes when you're deep in the woods, with nothing but the whisper of the wind through the trees and the crackle of your campfire. That was the plan for this weekend. Just me, my backpack, and the woods. The place I chose was a small, isolated spot I'd found a couple of years ago, tucked between a deep valley and a ridge. No trails leading to it and no one else around. Just a small stream nearby, the sound of water trickling over rocks filling the silence. The forest here was dense, thick with pine trees and thick underbrush, so thick you could barely see past a few feet ahead of you. It felt safe in a way, like no one could get to you unless you invited them. I'd set up camp near the stream, the trees just thin enough to let in the last light of the day, but still dense enough to block out most of the outside world. The firewood I'd gathered snapped and crackled as I worked to get the fire going, the flames flickering and casting long shadows across the forest floor. The smell of burning pine and wood filled the air, and for a while, I just sat there, staring at the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. It wasn't long before the light faded and night settled in. I had set up my tent by the stream, the noise of the water providing a calming background as I cooked some simple food on my camp stove. It wasn't much, just some dehydrated meals and a granola bar, but it was enough. Sitting there, eating my dinner, I felt completely alone in the best way possible. But as the night deepened, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in the atmosphere. The sounds of the forest that had felt so comforting before were now a little sharper. The rustling of leaves seemed more deliberate, the wind carrying a strange chill. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the usual shift from day to night. Animals were probably starting to move around, and I was in their space after all. It wasn't unusual to hear the occasional movement, a branch snapping or an animal scurrying through the underbrush. I finished my meal and cleaned up, tossing the trash into a bear bag to hang in a tree away from the camp. As I settled into my tent, I zipped it up tightly, not bothering to set up a proper sleeping bag since it wasn't too cold. The sleeping pad was enough. I lay there, listening to the night, the distant howl of a coyote and the occasional rustle of animals in the trees. Then I heard something else. It was faint at first, like a soft crunching noise, almost like footsteps in the dry leaves. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was probably just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, moving through the brush. But the noise continued, getting closer, moving around the edges of my camp. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the light, skipping steps of small animals. These were heavy, deliberate footsteps, slow but firm. My heart rate picked up a little, and I sat up in my tent, straining to hear. The noise wasn't just one or two steps anymore. It was a consistent rhythm, coming from the direction of the forest, circling the camp. My mind raced. Could it be someone else? A camper, lost or coming through? I didn't think anyone else knew about this spot. Hell, I hadn't told a soul about it. I grabbed my flashlight from the pocket of my backpack, clicked it on, and shined it out through the mesh of the tent. The beam cut through the night, but it didn't reveal anything. The forest seemed still, except for the continued sound of footsteps, which had now slowed. I couldn't stay in the tent, not with the sound of something just out of reach pacing around my camp. I took a deep breath and grabbed my knife from my gear bag. There was no point in hiding anymore. If it was someone, I'd have to deal with it. If it wasn't, well, I'd have to deal with that too. Carefully, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, moving quietly. The fire had dimmed, and the glow of the embers barely lit the camp. The noise of the footsteps stopped when I moved, as if whatever it was had noticed me. I froze, my heart pounding. For a long minute, I stood there, listening, but there was nothing, only the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I moved closer to the fire, staying low, and tried to peer into the darkness beyond the ring of light. The forest felt so much darker now, the trees looming like giants in the night. Then I saw something, a flash of movement between two trees, just at the edge of the camp. It was quick, too quick to be an animal. I stood completely still, trying to keep my breathing steady, and scanned the area. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't dare shine it again. If there was someone or something out there, I didn't want to give away my position. The footsteps started up again. Slow, deliberate steps coming closer now. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickle, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't an animal. Animals didn't walk like that. I stepped back toward my tent, my eyes never leaving the shadows between the trees. The crunch of the forest floor underfoot seemed too loud now. I was trying to stay calm, trying to think clearly, but every instinct in me was screaming to get out of there. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, a loud snap of a twig, and a low growl. It was so close now. My flashlight flicked back on, and I pointed it directly in the direction of the noise. And that's when I saw it. A figure, a person, tall and dark, moving through the trees. For a moment, my heart stopped. Then it shifted. It wasn't a person at all. The figure didn't have the shape of a man. There was something off about it, like it was hunched, the way it moved. My stomach turned. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I didn't care about anything anymore, just getting away from whatever that was. The forest was thick, the underbrush grabbing at my legs as I stumbled through the dark. I didn't know where I was going, just away from that thing. I could hear it behind me, the heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, gaining on me. I pushed harder, my heart racing, lungs burning. I had no idea how long I ran, but eventually, I came to a clearing. I had no choice now. I turned, standing my ground as the creature or person or whatever it was emerged from the trees. I didn't wait to see what it would do. My flashlight flickered again, revealing something that I had almost missed. A pile of rocks stacked high in the center of the clearing. Without thinking, I moved toward them, my mind racing for anything I could use to defend myself. The figure paused not far behind. I could feel its presence, the weight of its stare on my back. I reached the rocks and grabbed one, holding it tightly in my hands. My pulse thudded in my ears. The figure moved forward again, but this time slowly. I raised the rock, ready to throw it, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a creature. It was a man, dirty, ragged, with wild eyes, wearing nothing but torn clothes. I froze. He stared at me for a long moment before he spoke, his voice low and broken. Lost, need help. His words didn't make any sense. I didn't know whether to run, to help, or to just leave him behind. But I did the only thing I could. I tossed the rock aside and turned back the way I had come, racing back toward my camp. By the time I reached my tent, the man, if he even was a man, was gone. I stayed up for the rest of the night, staring into the woods, waiting for something else to move. The sound of my breathing, the rush of adrenaline still pounding in my chest, were the only things I could hear. In the morning, I packed up quickly, leaving without a second thought. Whatever had happened in the forest that night stayed with me as I walked out, but I never went back. I had been looking forward to my weekend getaway. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from the chaos of city life. It wasn't the most luxurious place, but it had everything I needed. A wood stove, a small kitchen, and a porch that looked out over a lake surrounded by thick pine trees. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. No phones, no distractions, just quiet. I figured a few days alone would help me clear my head. I drove up on Friday evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The drive had been longer than I expected, especially since I had taken a few wrong turns, but I was almost there. The last few miles were narrow, gravel roads, and I could barely see in the dim light. When I finally arrived, the place was just as I remembered from the listing online. Rustic, remote, with an eerie kind of calm hanging in the air. I unloaded my bags and settled in quickly. It was getting late, so I lit the stove and made a simple dinner. The cabin creaked in the wind, but I didn't mind. It was part of the charm. After I ate, I sat by the window, watching the night settle over the lake. It was pitch black outside, and the only sounds I could hear were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. It was perfect. No distractions, no people. At around 9 p.m., I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't a loud knock, more like a soft tap. I froze, unsure if I had imagined it. It was strange. There were no other cabins nearby, no one should be out here. But then I heard it again, more insistent this time. I stood up and walked cautiously toward the door, peeking out through the small window beside it. My heart skipped when I saw a woman standing just outside the porch light's reach, her face hidden in the shadows. She was dressed in a long, worn-out coat and had her head tilted downward, so I couldn't make out much of her features. I felt an immediate chill crawl up my spine. I didn't open the door. I stayed quiet, hoping she would go away, but she didn't. Instead, she knocked again, slower this time, almost like she was testing me. The knock was soft, deliberate, almost rhythmic. I felt an unease wash over me, but I knew I had to do something. I hesitated for a moment before I spoke through the door. "Can I help you?" There was no response, only silence. I waited, feeling the minutes stretch on. Eventually, the woman shuffled her feet, and I heard the faint sound of her breathing. It wasn't a normal, steady breath. It was like she was gasping, as if each breath was a struggle. "Hello," I called again, trying to sound calm, but my voice cracked. She didn't answer, but after a long moment, I heard her shuffle away from the door. I waited for a while longer, standing there, listening. My pulse raced in my ears. There was no sound of footsteps walking away, no rustling of the wind in the trees. It was as if the whole world had gone still. I waited for what felt like forever before I decided to check outside. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and opened the door slowly. The air outside was cool and crisp, and the silence was overwhelming. There was no sign of the woman, no trace of anyone standing there. I stepped onto the porch, shining the light around the yard. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the empty gravel path that led to the road. There was nothing. No footprints, no broken twigs, not even a sign that someone had been there. I stood there for a long time, my breath fogging up in the cold night air, before finally closing the door and locking it. I was still on edge, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just lost or looking for help. It was late, but that didn't explain the odd way she had acted. The way she knocked, the way she stood there so still, like she was waiting for something. I spent the rest of the night keeping the lights low, listening for any sounds outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. At some point, I drifted off to sleep, but it was fitful. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made me jump. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping. The sky outside was a pale blue, and the sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the porch. I felt a little more at ease with the daylight streaming in. I made coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the lake. But then something caught my eye. A figure stood at the far end of the property, near the tree line. It was a woman wearing the same long coat, but this time I could see her face. Her skin was pale, almost sickly white, and her hair hung loose, matted, and tangled around her face. She didn't seem to move, just standing there, staring into the woods. I froze, staring back at her. I wasn't sure if she had seen me, but I quickly ducked behind the curtain, hoping she hadn't noticed me. My mind raced. Was it the same woman from last night? Why was she back? What did she want? I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave the cabin and risk running into her, but I couldn't stay cooped up forever. I grabbed my keys and decided to drive into town for a bit. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I needed to do something. Maybe I'd find a store, maybe I'd talk to someone, anything to get me out of the cabin for a while. I pulled out of the driveway, careful not to draw attention to myself. The gravel road was quiet, and for a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman following me. But the road was empty behind me. I spent a couple of hours in town, walking around and trying to distract myself. I picked up some supplies at the general store and grabbed a coffee from a local diner. It helped to be around people again, even if they didn't know me. Felt safer. When I returned to the cabin, The sun was beginning to set again. The feeling of unease crept back over me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I locked the door behind me and started a fire in the stove to warm up the place. I had just started to relax when I heard a knock again. Soft, slow, rhythmic. My heart dropped. I didn't move at first, hoping it would go away. But the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I stood up slowly, the fire crackling behind me. I grabbed the flashlight and approached the door. I didn't know what to expect, but I wasn't about to open it without knowing who was there. I peered through the window, and my stomach dropped when I saw the woman again, standing just outside the porch light's reach. Her face was pale, expressionless. Her eyes were fixed on the door, but she didn't make a sound. I could feel my pulse racing as I backed away from the door. This wasn't normal. She had been here earlier, and now she was back. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to leave. I grabbed my bag, shoved a few things into it, and headed for the door. I wasn't about to stick around to figure out what she wanted. I wasn't sure if she was dangerous, but I didn't care to find out. I stepped outside, heart pounding, and made my way quickly to the car. I didn't look back, but as I reached the driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time as I drove away. The cabin faded into the distance, and I didn't stop until I reached the town. The feeling of dread didn't go away until I found myself in a safe, crowded place. I stayed at a small inn for the night, making sure to lock the door behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't know who the woman was or what she wanted, but the feeling of being watched, of something being off, stayed with me for a long time. Some things don't have explanations. Some things are better left alone. And I never, ever went back to those woods. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. A small cabin in the woods, just outside a remote town. Nothing fancy, just a place to unwind. My friends and I were looking forward to a couple of days away from everything. No phones, no distractions, just nature. It was late fall, the air crisp and cold, the trees losing their leaves in a thick blanket across the forest floor. The last bit of daylight barely cut through the branches as we unloaded our gear. The cabin itself was small but cozy. One room, a stone fireplace, an old wooden table that had seen better days, and two beds in the corners. The wooden floor creaked underfoot, and the walls, though sturdy, had a certain old-world charm to them, like they'd seen their share of people come and go. It smelled of pine and dust, the perfect spot for a weekend getaway. That evening, we sat around the fire outside, wrapped in jackets, talking about nothing in particular, just the usual banter between friends. The sound of the crackling fire and the chirping of crickets filled the air. Everything felt peaceful, almost idyllic. But as the night wore on, things started to shift. I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of animals, had all but disappeared. It was just still, too still. My friends were laughing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A coldness had settled in, not from the temperature, but from something else, something lurking in the silence. I didn't mention it at first. It was just my nerves, I thought. But then, around midnight, we started hearing noises from deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a deer moving through the underbrush, but it was too deliberate, too human-like. I didn't want to say anything, not wanting to sound paranoid. But as the night wore on, the noises grew louder. It was almost like footsteps, slow and heavy, moving through the brush just beyond the light from the fire. Then it stopped. Not just the footsteps, but all sound. There was nothing. No wind. No animals. Just silence. That's when I knew. Something was out there. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was a bear or something, I thought, but even as I convinced myself of that, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the back of my mind that said otherwise. My gut was telling me something was wrong, but I pushed it aside. The others were still oblivious, talking and joking like nothing had happened. They didn't hear what I heard. They didn't feel what I felt. Eventually, we called it a night. We went inside and sat around the small wood stove in the cabin, talking until we drifted off one by one. I don't know why I stayed awake longer than the others. Maybe I couldn't shake that feeling. Maybe I just didn't want to sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening. The cabin creaked in the night, the wind gently swaying the trees outside. But then I heard it again. The footsteps, closer this time. The hairs on my neck stood up. I held my breath, straining to listen, hoping it was just my imagination. But no, the sound was real. It was coming from outside, from the far side of the cabin. I got up quietly, trying not to wake my friends, and peered through the small window. There, just beyond the trees, was a shape. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it was moving slowly, almost methodically, through the darkness. I couldn't make out much detail, but the outline was unmistakable. Long limbs, gaunt. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal either. It moved like it was both, but not quite either. My heart raced as I stepped back from the window, my mind trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. But I knew what it was. The Wendigo. I didn't want to believe it. Couldn't. But I couldn't deny the stories, the legends I had heard growing up. My grandmother used to tell me about creatures that roamed the forests of the north. Things that weren't quite human. Things that hungered for flesh, for souls. And now, I was staring at one through the window of a cabin in the middle of nowhere. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake everyone up? Should we try to leave? But the fear that gripped me was paralyzing. I knew deep down that we couldn't outrun it. That's the thing with Wendigos, they don't chase. They don't need to. They just wait. They wait for you to make a mistake. And they're patient. The minutes stretched on, my mind racing as I watched the creature move slowly through the trees. It didn't seem to notice me. It didn't seem to care. It was only focused on something far away, something I couldn't see. The feeling in the pit of my stomach grew heavier with every passing second. I don't know how long I stood there, just watching, but eventually, the creature stopped. It tilted its head slightly, as if sensing me, as if it knew I was watching. My breath caught in my throat, and I pulled away from the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I backed up to the corner of the cabin, trying to stay out of sight. I didn't know what it wanted. I didn't know if it had seen me, if it knew I was inside, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I went back to my bed, trying to stay as quiet as possible, trying to calm myself down. I could hear the others breathing softly in their sleep, completely unaware of what was outside. I lay there in the dark, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. It felt like hours before I finally closed my eyes, but I never truly slept. The next morning, I didn't say anything. I didn't want to alarm anyone. They would have thought I was just scared, paranoid, but I knew what I had seen. I knew what had been out there. We spent the day hiking around, trying to keep our minds off the night before. The sun was out, the birds were chirping, and everything seemed normal again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those long, lanky limbs emerging from the trees. That night, the silence returned. The same stillness that had chilled me the night before. This time, I didn't wait for the footsteps. As soon as I heard something moving outside, I bolted upright, my heart in my throat. I wasn't going to sit there and wait for it to come to me. I woke my friends, my voice shaky as I told them we needed to leave, that we weren't safe here. Of course, they didn't believe me. They thought I was just overreacting, but I wasn't going to risk it. We packed our things quickly, not even bothering to be quiet. We grabbed what we could, rushed to the door, and made our way into the woods. The wind howled through the trees as we moved, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. I could feel the creature's presence, even though I couldn't see it. We made it to the car, and as I slammed the door shut, I looked out the window. In the distance, standing just outside the tree line, was the figure again. Tall, gaunt, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, locked onto us. It didn't move, didn't follow us. It just watched. We drove away as fast as we could, not stopping until we were miles down the road. And as we made our way back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped, that it was still out there, waiting for the next time we made a mistake. Last year, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a while. Take a solo hiking trip. I had been feeling burnt out, caught up in the daily grind, and the idea of getting away to clear my head sounded perfect. I chose Lassen Volcanic National Park because it wasn't too far from where I was living, and I had heard the trails there were peaceful, surrounded by raw nature. I didn't have a particular trail in mind, but I had read about the hike to the thermal vents and thought it'd be a good day trip. Nothing too strenuous, but enough to get away from it all. When I arrived at the trailhead, I immediately felt a sense of unease. It wasn't like a full-blown fear, but just an odd feeling, like my gut was telling me something wasn't quite right. The parking lot was empty except for a couple of cars, but the surrounding woods were so still, like they were holding their breath. I couldn't explain it. I chalked it up to being tired or maybe too many horror movies lately. Still, the feeling lingered as I began my hike, creeping in the back of my mind. The path wound through dense trees, their thick trunks standing like silent sentinels on either side. The sun filtered through the leaves and patches, casting strange shadows on the dirt trail. Every now and then, I'd hear a twig snap or the distant chirp of a bird, but nothing seemed to break the eerie silence that enveloped me. I thought I'd warm up after a few minutes, but the deeper I walked, the more on edge I felt. It wasn't that anything seemed off physically. Nothing was out of place. It was more of a vague, pressing feeling that something was there, watching, waiting. But when I'd stop and listen, all I heard was the wind in the trees. After a while, I reached the thermal vents, a strange landscape of bubbling pools and steaming ground. It was impressive, the sulfuric smell thick in the air, the ground underfoot warm to the touch. I took some pictures, trying to shake off the odd feeling that had clung to me since the start of the hike. The vents were cool in their own way, scientifically fascinating, but they only seemed to add to my discomfort. The quiet was heavier here, more oppressive, like it was all too easy to get lost in this remote place. I didn't stick around too long, even though I had come all this way. Instead, I decided to head back to my car, maybe take a break and then check out a different part of the park. The way back felt different though. The trail that had seemed welcoming on the way out now felt like it was closing in on me, the trees seeming taller, darker. I tried to shake off my unease, but it wouldn't go away. It was when I was about halfway back that I heard it. A low growl. It wasn't loud, not like something that would send you into full-on panic, but enough to freeze me in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat as I stood still, straining my ears. I turned around, scanning the trees behind me, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of any animal. But that growl echoed in my mind, something low and guttural, almost like it was warning me to stay put. I decided to keep moving, but now I was hyper-aware of every little sound around me. My feet crunched on the dirt trail, the leaves beneath my boots louder than usual. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed, but I didn't dare stop to check. Every now and then, I'd hear something, twigs snapping or leaves rustling in the underbrush. My eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the sounds, but I saw nothing. Whatever it was good at staying hidden. It wasn't until I reached a small clearing that I spotted it. Just a glimpse at first. A dark shape moving between the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and my body froze. I didn't move a muscle, watching as the black figure shifted, and then it came into view. A black bear. My pulse thudded in my ears as I stood completely still. The bear was about 40 yards away, walking the same direction I was, but it wasn't heading toward me. It was just moving along like it didn't care I was there. Still, I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Every instinct in me telling me to stay quiet, to not make a sound. I stood there for what felt like ages, watching as the bear ambled through the trees, its dark fur blending with the shadows. My heart was racing, pounding hard in my chest as I weighed my options. I didn't want to risk angering it or surprising it, so I decided to keep moving. Slowly, quietly, I resumed walking, my eyes locked on the bear's retreating form. For what felt like an eternity, I kept my distance, moving as carefully as I could, always keeping the bear in sight. It didn't seem to notice me, just walking along, oblivious to my presence. Still, I felt the weight of every step, every sound, every movement in the trees. I kept walking, my legs shaking, my mind spinning. I knew I had to get out of there. I had to make it back to my car. Finally, after what felt like an endless stretch of time, I reached a meadow. The bear was nowhere to be seen. My legs were like jelly as I started to move faster. The air felt lighter out in the open, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. The last stretch of the hike felt like a race against time, my feet pounding on the dirt trail, every rustle in the brush making my heart leap in my chest. I didn't dare look back. I just focused on reaching my car, knowing that it was the only place I'd be safe. 2 miles later, I finally saw it, my car. I didn't even slow down. I got to the parking lot, hopped in, and started the engine before I even buckled my seatbelt. My hands were shaking as I drove out of the lot, leaving the trail behind, the tension starting to ease just a little. I kept driving, not sure where I was going, but just away from there. The road was long and empty, winding through the park, and I was grateful to be in the car, moving away from whatever had been lurking in those woods. I didn't stop to rest. I drove straight to a more popular part of the park where there were more hikers, more people around. I didn't want to be alone in that silence again. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me, a nagging fear I couldn't explain. All I could think about was that growl, the sound of twigs snapping, the dark shape of the bear in the trees. Even though I was in a more populated area, I couldn't help but feel that sense of unease lingering. The noise of other people and the chatter of hikers around me were comforting, but I couldn't shake the tension in my shoulders. The woods had felt different, like they were hiding something, like I wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure I ever wanted to be out there alone again. Later, when I looked up the area and read about the wildlife in the park, I realized just how lucky I had been. Black bears are common in Lassen, but they don't usually pose a threat unless they're startled or feel cornered. But the growl, it wasn't something I could easily forget. The whole encounter felt like it was trying to teach me something, that nature is wild and untamed, and sometimes the best thing to do is respect that distance, no matter how well prepared you think you are. I didn't share the story with many people. Most wouldn't understand. They'd think I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. I had felt that primal fear, the kind that tells you when you're too close to danger, and I wasn't about to ignore it again. It was late summer when my girlfriend and I decided to take a trip with her family to camp in the Adirondack Mountains near Warrensburg, New York. The kind of place you go to get away from it all. Tall pines, crisp mountain air, and the sound of wind in the trees. The whole family had been planning this for months, and even though we were excited, I had my own reservations about the trip. Not because of the people, her family was great, but because the woods have a way of messing with me. There's something about being in nature that makes me feel uneasy, and I've had enough weird stuff happen on camping trips before to know not to take anything for granted. Her parents had bought a new camper the previous year, so this wasn't our first time staying in it, but it was still a new experience for us to all be together for a weekend getaway. It was a decent size, with enough space for her parents, her younger sister, and us. I was on the bottom bunk of the small sleeping area, the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the camper providing a sort of background noise to the otherwise silent night. We had arrived earlier that afternoon, and it was already dark by the time we were getting ready to settle in. Her younger sister was already asleep on the top bunk, curled up and quietly breathing. My girlfriend and I were the only ones awake. She was scrolling through her phone, lying in the bunk above me, and I was on mine as well, flicking through random things before going to sleep. The window by my bunk was cracked open just a little, enough to let in some of that cool mountain air, but not enough to make the inside too chilly. The night was calm, peaceful, the kind of quiet you get when you're deep in the woods. You could barely hear the occasional rustling of the wind moving through the trees. At first, everything seemed completely normal, but then I heard it. First, it was faint, a soft sound like gravel shifting underfoot. My heart skipped a beat when I realized what it was. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Whoever it was walking around the camper, right outside my window. The sound was unmistakable. Distinct footfalls, steady, like someone taking slow, deliberate steps on gravel. The steps got closer, and I held my breath, trying to listen more closely. They weren't hurried or panicked, just calm, almost methodical. They stopped right outside the window, just a few feet away. My heart was pounding now. Whoever it was standing right there. I couldn't see anything through the darkly tinted glass. It was hard to make out any shapes or shadows, but I could feel the presence, a weight in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My phone screen was the only light in the room, and I quickly shut it off, hoping the person outside wouldn't notice. I was scared they might have seen the glow of my phone through the window. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, listening intently, but the footsteps didn't move. The silence stretched out, felt like hours, even though I knew it was only a few minutes. Then, just as quietly as they had appeared, the footsteps moved away. I couldn't hear anything else, not even the crunch of gravel as the person walked away. Everything felt off, like they were still out there, just waiting, watching. I didn't know if I should go outside to see who it was, but I had no intention of doing that. The fear was enough to keep me frozen where I was. I texted my girlfriend immediately. "Did you hear that?" I wasn't sure if she had heard the footsteps, but I knew I couldn't just lay there pretending like everything was normal. She responded a few moments later, confirming she had heard it too. I felt a little less crazy at that point, knowing that I wasn't the only one. But that didn't make the feeling go away. If anything, it made it worse. After a few moments of silence, we both heard something else. The sound of zippers. It was faint at first, like someone was opening the flap of a tent. The noise came from the direction of the two tents about 10 feet away from the camper. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't the wind. It was clearly the sound of someone going through something, moving around in the tents. My heart rate shot up again. The sound was unmistakable. It was definitely someone out there. My girlfriend was the first to react, waking up her parents to tell them what was going on. She wasn't sure if it was just an animal or if there was something more to it, but we couldn't ignore it. Her parents, half asleep, agreed to check it out, even though I'm sure they thought it was just a raccoon or some other small animal rummaging through the tents. After about 10 minutes, they returned. There was nothing outside, No signs of anyone, no footprints, nothing out of the ordinary. Just the tense, dark, and still. Despite the reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was something unsettling about how deliberate everything had felt. The footsteps, the zippers, the stillness afterward. It was like someone had been trying to make us aware of their presence, but had no intention of making a sound or drawing attention. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun came up, and the birds started chirping, just like every other morning in the woods. We packed up our things, had breakfast, and then went to talk to the older couple who had camped next to us. They had been up late, and when we mentioned the footsteps and the zippers, they said they had heard something too. The woman said it sounded like footsteps, like someone walking around their camper, but when they looked out, there was nothing. They just thought it was probably a bear or something similar, but they mentioned it in passing like it was just another odd thing that happens when you're in the woods. We didn't talk about it much after that. It wasn't something that came up in conversation, and everyone just brushed it off like it was nothing. But for the rest of the weekend, we stayed on high alert. The weird feeling didn't quite go away, and it certainly didn't help that we never saw any signs of animals. No tracks, no droppings, no evidence that a bear or raccoon had been near. It was like whatever was out there was just gone. We never heard or saw anything else that weekend. The trip ended on a quiet note, and we packed up to leave, heading home with the same unease that had settled over us the night before. We didn't return to that spot the following year. My girlfriend's family made the decision to camp elsewhere, and I couldn't blame them. The thought of going back, of camping in that same spot, didn't sit right with any of us. Looking back now, I still don't know what happened that night. Was it someone just wandering around the campgrounds? Maybe it was. But why would they walk so slowly, so deliberately? Why didn't we hear a vehicle or see any signs of anyone? Felt like someone was just there, watching. I've been in the woods enough to know that things can feel off sometimes. You can hear things that don't make sense, see shadows where there are none. But that night, with the footsteps, the zippers, the silence, it didn't feel like the usual wilderness oddities. Felt like someone was out there, and they wanted us to know it. I can't explain it. I don't know if I'll ever be able to, but I do know one thing. I'm not going back to that spot. Not ever. I've always enjoyed the quiet of the woods. It's one of those things that makes you feel like you're in your own world, away from the noise and rush of everything. When I decided to rent this little cabin up on a remote hill, I thought I was escaping into peace, something I could truly unwind with. Just me, the trees, the sound of the wind, and the occasional rustle of animals moving through the brush. I wasn't expecting anything to go wrong, nor was I looking for trouble. I'd arrived earlier that afternoon, unpacked my things, set up a little campfire outside, and spent the daylight hours just soaking in the view. The cabin itself was rustic, but in the best way. Wooden beams, a stone fireplace, the faint smell of cedar. Everything was perfect for what I had in mind. My plan was simple. Relax for a few days, read, maybe go for some long walks in the forest. By the time night came around, the full moon had risen, casting its silver light across the forest floor. I was inside, sitting in front of the fire, flipping through an old book I'd found in the cabin's bookshelf when I heard it. The tapping. It was faint at first, almost like a branch brushing against the window, but the sound grew louder. I stood up and walked over, peeking through the curtains to see what was making the noise. Nothing. Just the wind, maybe, I thought to myself. I brushed it off and sat back down, trying to get back into my book. But that's when it happened again. A tap, then another. It wasn't wind this time. Something or someone was outside. I went to the window again, pulling the curtains aside just enough to peer out. I couldn't see anything, just the shadows of the trees and the distant outline of the hill. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was quick, too quick to get a full glimpse, but it was there. I turned the lamp off, plunging the room into near darkness, and sat quietly, trying to hear anything else. There it was again, a shuffle, the soft rustle of something in the leaves outside. I felt my pulse quicken. Who would be out here this far from town? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen another soul since I'd arrived. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and shone it out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the trees and the empty yard. I let out a slow breath. It's nothing, I told myself. Just the wind or an animal. I leaned back against the chair, but the unease in my chest didn't let up. I tried to push it aside, but it kept gnawing at me. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing just beyond the glow of the flashlight. It was too far for me to make out the details, but there was no mistaking the shape of a person. A person standing still, staring at the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I dropped the flashlight. I wasn't sure if it had been the light or my own breath that caused the figure to twitch, but it was enough to make me freeze in place. Whoever it was didn't move for what felt like an eternity. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to explain this, but all I could do was stare back through the window, hoping they hadn't seen me. The figure wasn't moving toward the door, but neither was it leaving. It just stood there, too still, too quiet. I tried to tell myself it was just some confused person. Maybe someone lost in the woods, looking for help. But I couldn't shake the feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right. I crept toward the back of the cabin, staying low to the ground. I peeked through the narrow window in the kitchen, hoping to get a better view of whoever was out there. My pulse hammered in my ears, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. And then I saw it. Through the corner of the window, just barely in the frame, was the outline of an old man's face. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed directly on me. I jumped back, my heart slamming against my ribs. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't just a passerby or some traveler. This was someone who had been standing outside, watching me, and he knew I was here. I quickly moved to the door, checking the lock. It was secure. I double-checked it just in case. But I couldn't shake the image of that face out of my head. The way his eyes seemed to pierce through the window, as if he had been watching for far longer than I'd realized. I didn't know what to do. The logical part of me said to call the police, but I wasn't sure if they'd even get here in time. And the more I thought about it, the more I felt like doing nothing was the better option. If I kept quiet, maybe he'd go away. But as I stood there, listening to the silence outside, I heard a soft tap at the window again. This time it was right by the door. I held my breath, trying to steady myself. Then it came again, louder this time, more insistent. Top, top, top. I could feel the cold sweat running down my back. I knew what I had to do, but I didn't want to. I turned toward the back door, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the kitchen. I needed to get out, to put as much distance between myself and whoever was outside. But as I opened the door, I froze. There, on the other side of the doorframe, was the same old man. His face was pale, drawn with deep lines, and his hair was wild, sticking out in every direction. But his eyes were the worst part. They were wide open, fixed on me, and filled with something darker than just curiosity. It was as if he wasn't seeing me at all, but something beyond me, something that made him more dangerous than I could comprehend. I didn't wait to find out what he would do. I slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. I moved toward the back window, careful not to make a sound, and peered outside. But the man was gone. The only sign of him was the fading imprint of his handprint on the window, smudged with dirt and sweat. I backed away, my legs unsteady beneath me. I couldn't understand what was happening. My mind was racing with questions, but they only made me more frantic. I spent the rest of the night watching every shadow, every creak of the cabin. I didn't dare fall asleep. When the first rays of sunlight finally filtered through the trees the next morning, I was still awake, exhausted and terrified. The man never returned. No sign of him, not even a trace. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I do know one thing. I wasn't going to stay there any longer. I packed my things and left before the day could fully start. I haven't been back to that cabin since, and I don't ever intend to. There are some things you don't ignore, and there are some things you don't let in. The old man was one of those things, and I learned that the hard way.